Las Vegas, early 1970s. The press room of the Hilton hums with restless energy. The sharp buzz of cameras, the scratch of pens, the haze of cigarette smoke hanging low. Dozens of reporters from New York, Los Angeles, Chicago crowd shoulder to shoulder, chasing a headline. Some want a quote, others a scandal. Then the door opens. Elvis Presley steps in. He isn't in rhinestones tonight, just a dark jacket, a calm smile, a nod to the crowd. Flashbulbs ignite, shutters clatter. For a moment, the room tilts toward respect, even admiration. And then it happens. From the back row, a voice cuts through the noise. A laugh, sharp and mocking. "Tell us, Elvis, do you always talk in that funny Southern accent, or is it just for show?" The words land like a slap. The room freezes. A few reporters choke down nervous laughter. Others glance at their notepads, ashamed to meet his eyes. Cameras keep snapping, each click louder than the last. Elvis doesn't answer. Not yet. His smile fades. He lowers his gaze to the microphone, then lifts it again, locking eyes with the man who mocked him. The air grows heavy, thick with expectation. The world is about to find out how the king responds when his roots, his very identity, are dragged into question. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The middle of the 1960s found Elvis Presley at a crossroads that few men could ever imagine. To the public, he was already a living legend, his name inseparable from the birth of rock and roll. To insiders, however, doubts lingered. After his service in the U.S. Army, he had been funneled into a string of Hollywood films, light musicals and formulaic scripts that kept him visible but drained him of the raw electricity that had once set the world on fire. And hovering over every press junket, every interview, every attempt to reclaim his place on stage was something as small and as large as the sound of his voice, his Southern accent. The accent was not something he had cultivated, it was simply who he was. Raised in Tupelo, Mississippi, and later in Memphis, Tennessee, Elvis spoke the way his family spoke, the way neighbors spoke in church pews and at factory gates. To millions of Americans, it sounded familiar, even comforting. But to many in the press, particularly those from big cities on the East Coast or California, it was a marker of backwardness, a reminder of stereotypes they were quick to exploit. He had first encountered this contempt years earlier, in 1956, when his fame was still a flame consuming every corner of American youth culture. At one of his earliest national press events, a young reporter had leaned into the microphone and, with a smirk, asked him if he talked that way on purpose, to sound like some country boy. The room had erupted in nervous laughter. For Elvis, only 21 at the time, it had felt like a slap. His smile had faltered, but he had done what was expected of him. He laughed along, swallowed the sting, and moved on. Yet deep inside, the memory lodged like a thorn. By the mid-60s, these remarks had not disappeared. Critics seemed almost eager to remind him that while he had legions of fans, he was still, to them, a truck driver made good. A young man from a shotgun house who had stumbled into history. They mocked his diction as they mocked his sequined costumes, as if all of it was a trick, an act destined to fade. And yet, despite all their cynicism, audiences did not see it that way. Ordinary people, factory workers, mothers, fathers, young men returning from Vietnam, girls who saved tips from waitressing jobs, crowded theaters, and record stores. They heard in Elvis's accent something that spoke to them. A kind of raw honesty, a lack of pretense. That was the paradox of his career during those years. On the one hand, the elite derided him. On the other, the public adored him, clung to him. He embodied both the glitz of Hollywood and the plainness of the American South. The very feature the press considered a liability was, for millions, the reason he felt like theirs. Still, the tension wore on him. After returning from the Army, Elvis had tried to fit the mold Colonel Tom Parker and the film studios carved out. The movies brought wealth, but at a price. He felt trapped in roles that demanded little of his talent and stifled his instincts. Away from the stage, away from the screaming crowds, he often wrestled with doubt. Was the boy from Tupelo still inside him, or had the caricature swallowed him whole? It was during this period that he began to see the shape of his true dilemma. Every time he opened his mouth in front of journalists, he could see the flicker of condescension. They were waiting for him to stumble, to sound uneducated, to confirm their prejudices. And each time he had to decide, does he hide it, soften the accent, attempt a more neutral delivery? Or does he hold firm, speak the way he always had, and risk ridicule? The choice was not simply linguistic. It was existential. His accent was more than sound. It was memory. It was identity. It carried the voice of his mother, Gladys, who had sung gospel hymns in the kitchen. It carried the voice of his father, Vernon, worn down by hard labor but never defeated. It carried Sunday mornings in Memphis churches and late nights on Beale Street, where rhythm and blues seeped into his very bones. To abandon that was to abandon himself. In private moments, he replayed those encounters with critics. He remembered the smirk of that first reporter in 1956, the flash of disdain in the eyes of columnists who considered him a novelty act, a phase that would soon burn out. They had been wrong about his music, wrong about his staying power. And slowly, as the 1960s unfolded, Elvis began to understand something else. They were also wrong about what his voice meant. If the press thought his accent made him small, the people thought the opposite. To fans in towns across America, he sounded like home. He was proof that greatness could come from a two-room house, from a family that barely scraped by, from the South that so many felt outsiders dismissed. What others saw as a weakness, they embraced as authenticity. And so, by the middle of that decade, Elvis began to make peace with the fact that the very thing critics mocked might be the thing that kept him closest to the hearts of millions. The laughter of reporters no longer stung as deeply. Instead, it revealed the gulf between their world and his. He was not theirs to define. He belonged to the people who cheered from the cheap seats, who carried transistor radios to schoolyards, who lined up for hours outside theaters. His accent was not an obstacle. It was the bridge. That realization, however, was not yet complete. For though he was beginning to sense its truth, the great test still lay ahead. An arena larger, harsher, more unforgiving than anything he had faced in his earliest days. Las Vegas would magnify everything: the lights, the stakes, the scrutiny. And when the question of his voice returned there, in front of the sharpest tongues in American media, he would have to decide once and for all how to answer. By 1970, the city of Las Vegas had become more than just a glittering desert oasis. It was a proving ground, a crucible for stars who either redefined themselves or faded into lounge act obscurity. For Elvis Presley, the return to live performance after nearly a decade trapped in Hollywood films was not simply a career move, it was a resurrection. The International Hotel, later renamed the Hilton, became his arena, and with it came both adoration and fresh scrutiny. The concerts themselves bordered on spectacle. When Elvis strode onto the stage in a jumpsuit that caught and scattered the spotlights like shards of glass, the audience erupted in a sound that bordered on hysteria. Women clutched their chests, men shouted his name, and even the most jaded celebrities in the front rows leaned forward as if drawn by a force they could not explain. Backed by a full band, a gospel quartet, and a powerful orchestra, he filled the cavernous showroom with a voice that seemed somehow both raw and refined, each note soaked in years of longing to perform. But the stage was only one half of the battlefield. The other half was found in the hotel's press rooms, where each engagement began with mandatory conferences before banks of cameras and clusters of journalists. These sessions had the texture of rituals, thick clouds of cigarette smoke hanging under fluorescent lights, the constant whirring of film cameras, and the sharp scratch of pens against paper as reporters jotted down every gesture, every word. Elvis always entered these rooms with a smile. He shook hands, nodded, even cracked light jokes. Years of discipline had taught him to maintain courtesy, no matter the provocation. He was, after all, raised to respect people, even when they did not return the courtesy. But the atmosphere in those press gatherings carried a sharp edge. Some reporters truly wanted to understand him, to capture the essence of a man who had transformed American music. Others, however, arrived armed with barbed questions, their tone less about discovery than about dismantling the myth. The divide was cultural as much as professional. Many of the journalists flown in from New York or Los Angeles had little patience for Southern roots. They saw his mannerisms as a show, his accent as proof of unsophistication. To them, Elvis was a relic, a reminder of teenage hysteria from the 1950s, now out of step with the turbulence of the 1970s when America was steeped in protests, politics, and the changing soundscape of rock. In their eyes, he was yesterday's headline, dressed in rhinestones. The tension was not always visible at first. The questions often began benignly. How does it feel to be back on stage? Or, what do you think of the music scene today? But inevitably, one voice would cut through, laced with irony, pressing into more personal territory. It was not enough to ask about the music. They wanted to prod at his persona, his weight, his age, his accent. They wanted to expose weakness. At one conference in the early 1970s, a young reporter leaned forward, his tie slightly loosened, his expression smug. He began by congratulating Elvis on the sold-out shows, but his words soon twisted. "Some people say," he declared loudly enough for the microphones to catch, "that your career peaked a decade ago. That the jumpsuits, the shows, this is nostalgia, not relevance. What do you say to that?" The room shifted. A few chuckles rippled from the back rows. Another journalist added a follow-up, his tone even sharper. "And do you think maybe people come to hear you more for who you used to be than who you are now?" It was a duel disguised as inquiry. Elvis, still seated at the long table with water glasses and microphones, gave a faint smile and adjusted the ring on his finger. He leaned toward the mic, his voice steady, his manner still gracious. "Well, sir," he began, "I just sing the way I feel, and if people want to come hear it, I'm grateful." Polite, non-confrontational, but the scent of provocation lingered in the air. And then came the pivot, the subtle escalation. Another journalist, younger than most, his hair stylishly long, leaned forward with a grin. He didn't bother masking the disdain. "Elvis," he asked, "do you ever think maybe the accent helps? You know, keeping that small-town sound, making you seem more approachable? Or is it just hard to shake?" The phrasing carried the weight of insult, though dressed as curiosity. A few of his colleagues smirked. To them, it was harmless banter. To others in the room, it was an unspoken sneer at the man before them, a suggestion that his very identity was a costume. The cameras buzzed, lenses zooming in. The smoke from cigarettes seemed to thicken, coiling under the hot lights. Those who had witnessed him before knew the danger of such moments. Elvis could be gracious, but he could also be cutting when cornered. For a man who had endured years of ridicule for something as simple as the way he spoke, the provocation was not just professional. It was personal. And yet, Elvis did not raise his voice. He sat back in his chair, tapping a finger against the table. His eyes flicked briefly over the crowd of journalists, as though measuring them, weighing whether to answer at all. Some reporters scribbled more furiously, sensing a headline was about to be born. Others exchanged nervous glances, aware that the line had been crossed. This was the paradox of Las Vegas. On stage, Elvis Presley reigned without question. The cheers thundered, the music soared. But in those press rooms, stripped of instruments and spotlight, he faced a different trial. Whether he could defend not just his music, but his very being against the sharpened pens of men who saw themselves as arbiters of taste. The irony was sharp. The very city that had lifted him to a new pinnacle was also the place where voices of doubt grew loudest. Each time he walked into those rooms, he knew what awaited: smoke, flashes, and questions that carried daggers. Yet he kept coming back, perhaps because he understood that the fight for respect was as much a performance as any concert. And on that particular afternoon in 1972, when the younger reporter pushed his luck, the performance was about to turn into something else entirely. The year was 1972, and the Hilton's press room buzzed like a beehive before Elvis Presley walked in. It was an oddly shaped chamber, half office, half theater, fitted with rows of folding chairs, a long white-draped table at the front, and a nest of microphones angled like metallic thorns toward whoever dared sit behind them. Photographers lined the back wall, cameras preloaded, straps looped tight across their shoulders. Cigarette smoke already clung to the air like a curtain, curling into the ceiling tiles. When Elvis appeared, dressed not in one of his glittering stage costumes, but in a tailored jacket with a subtle flare at the collar, the room swiveled toward him. Applause broke out, not thunderous like on stage, but hesitant, polite. He smiled anyway, a smile that had the warmth of sunlight even under fluorescent glare. He lowered himself into the chair at the center of the table, took a sip of water, and folded his hands in front of him. The questions began. Some were predictable, almost perfunctory. How do you keep your energy for 2 shows a night? What makes Vegas different from other stages? Elvis answered with charm, his voice low and unhurried. He cracked a small joke about staying out of trouble and eating too many fried peanut butter sandwiches, which drew scattered laughter. For a moment, the room softened, but it never lasted long. In the second row, a young reporter from a prominent East Coast paper waited for his turn. He was new to the circuit, but his ambition shone through his sharp suit and sharper eyes. When he finally raised his hand, the moderator nodded, and he leaned forward toward the microphones. "Elvis," he began with exaggerated courtesy, "first let me congratulate you on filling seats again. Not every star from the 50s can say the same." The phrasing had an edge, but Elvis inclined his head politely. "My question is this. Some people wonder whether your success here is about nostalgia more than music. Do you think audiences are coming to relive the past, or are you offering them something genuinely new?" Elvis paused, his fingers brushing the rim of his glass. He gave a diplomatic answer about always trying to bring freshness to his shows, about blending old favorites with new songs. His tone was calm, practiced, the kind of response that diffused tension without igniting more. But the reporter was not finished. As Elvis leaned back, another voice cut in, this time not curious, but mocking. "Or maybe," the young journalist said louder, letting his words hang in the haze of smoke, It's the way you talk that keeps them hooked. That good old down-home drawl. Do you practice it? Or is it just impossible to get rid of? The words struck like a stone against glass. For a moment, no one moved. A ripple of laughter slipped from a few corners of the room, the uneasy kind that feeds on discomfort. One photographer, startled, clicked his camera a second too late, capturing Elvis mid-blink. The reporter himself grinned broadly, as if daring Presley to react. Elvis's smile faltered. He lowered his eyes to the table, as if considering the wood grain more important than the man before him. His hand tightened on the water glass. He took a slow sip, then set it down carefully, as though he needed the pause to swallow something heavier than water. The air grew thick. A cough sounded in the back. A chair squeaked. The sound of cameras snapping suddenly felt intrusive, metallic, almost hostile. Elvis remained silent, his expression unreadable, but the muscles in his jaw flexed once, then again. From the side of the room, an older reporter, one who had covered him since 1956, shifted uncomfortably. He muttered something to his neighbor, perhaps a rebuke, but the younger journalist ignored it. The smirk stayed planted on his face. He thought he had scored a clever blow. The atmosphere in the room changed. It was no longer routine. It was theater, charged with the possibility of explosion. Some reporters leaned forward eagerly, sensing headlines. Others avoided eye contact, ashamed of the cruelty masquerading as wit. And Elvis? He sat motionless for several seconds that felt like minutes. His smile was gone. His head tilted slightly downward, as though he were listening to something far away. When he finally lifted his gaze, his eyes locked directly onto the reporter's. The warmth was gone. In its place was a cool, steady light, unblinking. The cameras clicked again, dozens of shutters capturing the silence. To those in the room, it was as if the temperature had dropped. Everyone waited for the explosion. A sharp retort, a flash of anger, a demand to end the conference. That would have been natural. That would have been expected. But Elvis did not explode. He let the silence stretch, taut as a wire. His fingers tapped once against the microphone. His mouth parted slightly, then closed again, as though the words forming inside him needed more weight before they could be spoken. Every eye was on him. Every breath was held. And in that suspended moment, no one in the room could tell whether they were about to witness the collapse of his composure or the beginning of something far more powerful. The moment after the reporter's mocking remarks seemed to stretch beyond time. The laughter that had flickered through the room died almost instantly, as though everyone realized they had just crossed an invisible line. The Hilton's press chamber, usually loud with overlapping questions and chatter, descended into a strange hush. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than before, their faint buzz slicing the silence like a blade. Elvis did not answer right away. He sat perfectly still, his back pressed against the chair, his hands resting on the table. The water glass, half full, stood untouched beside him. His head was angled slightly downward, his eyes fixed on the microphone as if it were the only object anchoring him in that heavy moment. For those who watched closely, it was clear. He was not merely pausing. He was swallowing something vast, something layered with years of memory. The room could feel it. Seconds ticked by, each one carving deeper into the collective tension. A young photographer at the back nervously adjusted his camera strap, the squeak of leather startling in the stillness. Another journalist, perhaps trying to ease the weight, cleared his throat and threw out a clumsy, unrelated question about favorite songs. The attempt at levity fell flat. No one laughed. Instead, it only underlined the fact that the room was frozen, waiting for Elvis to respond. Across the table, the reporter who had spoken, the smirking young man in the crisp suit, shifted in his chair with the confidence of someone who thought he had landed a clever blow. His pen tapped idly against his notepad. He leaned back slightly, as if daring Presley to lash out, to lose his composure. But Presley did not lash out. He lifted his eyes for the first time, scanning the rows of faces before him. His gaze was steady, not angry, but piercing in a way that made several reporters instinctively lower their eyes. It wasn't fury they saw, it was evaluation, a cold measurement, as though he were silently asking each of them, "Do you share his laughter? Do you see me as less because of who I am?" The silence pressed harder. Even the sound of camera shutters, which had been constant since the beginning of the conference, slowed. Photographers hesitated, unsure whether capturing this raw moment would break the spell or immortalize it. The few clicks that did echo off the walls sounded like gunfire in a church. Then, from the far side of the room, an older journalist spoke. His voice was gravelly, tired, but steady. "That's enough, kid," he muttered, not quite loud enough to command the room, but clear enough to be heard by half of it. He had covered Elvis since the 1950s, had been there when the world first saw the boy from Memphis shake his hips on live television. He knew the sting behind such words. Yet the rebuke only deepened the tension. The younger reporter smirked wider, as though being told to stop had given him the victory he sought. The clash between generations, the old guard who remembered the birth of rock and roll and the new one eager to dismantle myths, was suddenly visible in that cramped Vegas room. Elvis still did not speak. His silence itself became an act, deliberate and heavy. Each second stretched further, until the air itself seemed ready to snap. To the men and women in that space, it felt less like waiting for a response and more like standing at the edge of a cliff, uncertain whether the ground beneath them would crumble or hold. One reporter nervously scribbled notes he couldn't later read. Another shifted her chair back an inch, as if the physical distance could ease the intensity. Somewhere near the door, someone coughed again, a dry, nervous bark that sounded far too loud in the hush. Presley finally reached for the glass of water. His hand was steady, but the motion carried the gravity of ritual. He lifted it slowly, sipped once, then lowered it to the table. That was all. No words yet. Just silence, deliberate and unyielding. It was a masterclass in restraint, though no one in the room could have called it that in the moment. To them, it was suspense. Unbearable. Electric. Every person present, from the most seasoned reporter to the youngest photographer, knew instinctively that when he finally did open his mouth, whatever he said would carry more weight than any prepared statement. The younger reporter leaned forward again, his pen still in hand, ready to write down the reaction he thought he had provoked. But when Presley turned his head toward him, slowly, deliberately, there was no anger, only a calm, unflinching stare that stripped the smirk of its power. The silence had turned from absence into presence. It wasn't emptiness, it was command. Elvis's refusal to fill it immediately had shifted the entire room. The balance of power had changed. No longer was he the performer at the mercy of journalists' questions. Now he was the man making them wait, forcing them to feel the weight of their own words. And though no one yet knew it, this moment of waiting, this quiet before the storm, would make what came next unforgettable. The silence in the Hilton's press room lingered, but in Presley's mind, it carried him far from Las Vegas. In those suspended seconds, as cameras clicked and journalists fidgeted, he was not a superstar under hot lights. He was a boy again, standing barefoot on the uneven wooden floors of a two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi. That little house, painted white, but weathered gray by time, was where the sound of his voice first took shape. His mother, Gladys, spoke in a soft drawl that wrapped words in warmth. His father, Vernon, carried the heavier cadence of a man worn by hard labor and worry. To outsiders, their voices might have sounded unpolished, provincial. But to Elvis, they were music, a rhythm of survival, of faith, of love that had little but gave everything. He remembered the sting of the schoolyard, too. Children repeating his phrases back at him with mocking exaggeration, teachers correcting his speech, as though it were wrong rather than simply different. The shame of it had burned into him early, that gnawing awareness that his words set him apart. He had learned to lower his eyes, to laugh off the jibes, to shrink the hurt deep inside. Later, when fame struck in 1956, he discovered that microphones only magnified what others once mocked. In those first interviews, when the world wanted to know the boy who shook the stage, reporters sometimes smirked at the way he answered. They called it quaint, corn-pone, even a put-on. Each barb landed heavier than the last, because they weren't mocking just him. They were mocking the people who raised him, the neighbors he'd grown up around, the very soil that had shaped him. The irony was bitter. That same voice, the one some derided, was the same voice that had carried gospel hymns at church revivals, that had soaked in blues drifting from Beale Street, that had lifted into country ballads on late-night radios. It was the crucible where all those sounds fused into something new. Without that accent, without that rootedness, there might never have been an Elvis Presley at all. The years of film work in Hollywood had tested his identity further. Surrounded by polished diction and calculated image-making, he had sometimes wondered if he should sand down the edges of his speech. He tried once or twice, in certain interviews, softening vowels, sharpening consonants, but each attempt felt false, as though he were betraying not just himself, but every factory worker, farmhand, and small-town dreamer who had ever seen in him a reflection of their own voice. The turning point had come in 1968. The television special, the comeback special, as people would later call it, forced him to confront who he was, stripped of the movie roles and the glitter. Standing there in black leather, surrounded by a small audience only feet away, he had felt the pulse of his old hunger. He spoke casually between songs, his drawl unguarded, and the crowd leaned into it, not away. That night, he realized he would never again apologize for sounding like himself. And yet, here in Las Vegas, the wound reopened. The reporter's taunt carried echoes of every insult he had endured from childhood to stardom. It was not simply a question about speech. It was a dismissal of his very roots. To ridicule his voice was to ridicule Gladys humming in the kitchen, Vernon's weary evening talk, the voices of Tupelo neighbors who had prayed for rain or for work. It was to erase the America that had raised him. He thought, too, of the millions of fans across the country who still spoke with the same cadence. The truck drivers hauling goods through the night, the farmers at dawn, the factory workers who whistled his tunes during lunch breaks. They heard themselves in him. They did not hear a joke. They heard affirmation. The silence in the room thickened as these memories coiled inside him. He recalled the decision he'd made years earlier, never again to be ashamed. His accent was not a mask. It was a flag, one that belonged not just to him, but to every person who had been told their voice made them less. The laughter of one reporter could not erase that truth. Still, the sting was there, as fresh as it had been when he was a boy, mocked on the playground. The weight of history pressed against his chest, demanding to be spoken. He lifted his gaze again, this time not with hesitation, but with resolve. The silence had stretched long enough. In that silence, lived every humiliation, every memory of being told he did not belong. Now, the answer rising in him carried not just his own dignity, but the dignity of millions who shared the sound of his voice. And when he spoke, the room would never forget it. When Elvis's thoughts returned from the shadows of Tupelo to the Hilton's press chamber, the silence had only deepened. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer, trapping everyone in the gravity of the moment. The air was stale with smoke and nerves. Nobody shifted without drawing attention. Every creak of a chair, every cough, every scratch of a pen was magnified in the oppressive stillness. The young reporter who had mocked him leaned back with a smirk, confident that he had forced Presley into a corner. His pen dangled in one hand, his notepad balanced loosely in the other. He looked like a gambler certain he had won the hand before the cards were shown. But around him, the mood was changing. Some journalists stared at their notepads without writing, their shame evident in the way their eyes avoided Elvis's. A few photographers lowered their cameras, unsure whether they wanted to capture an image that felt almost indecent. The older reporters, veterans who remembered the electricity of 1956, sat rigid, their faces set in hard lines. They understood the weight of what was unfolding, and they did not like the direction it had taken. Elvis sat still at the center of it all, his hands resting near the microphone. He had not spoken yet, but the silence itself was beginning to feel like speech. The pause had stretched so long that even the boldest voices in the room were quiet now. What had begun as mockery was becoming something else, a moment teetering on the edge of history. His expression revealed little, yet it carried authority. Gone was the showman's easy grin, the boyish charm that often softened such encounters. In its place was a calm, almost regal composure. His eyes were cool, unblinking, as if measuring every man and woman in front of him. To those under his gaze, it was not comfortable. It was not anger, but it was something far more disarming, a refusal to be diminished. The reporter who had mocked him shifted again, this time less comfortably. The confidence in his posture faltered for just a moment. It was subtle, but noticeable. The power in the room had shifted. Someone tried to break the tension. A voice from the back, light, almost joking, called out a question about future film projects. It landed awkwardly, ignored by most, swallowed by the heavy air. The attempt at humor only underscored the seriousness of the moment. A veteran journalist near the front leaned to his neighbor and whispered, "Watch this. He's about to turn it around." It was less prediction than certainty, the instinct of someone who had witnessed Presley navigate storms before. Finally, Elvis moved. He leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between his mouth and the cluster of microphones. The gesture alone sent a ripple through the room. Pens rose, cameras snapped again, breath tightened. He did not speak right away. Instead, he let the anticipation build further. His hand adjusted the microphone slightly, his rings catching the glare of the lights. Then he looked up, not at the crowd as a whole, but directly at the young reporter who had mocked him. The stare was not harsh, but it was unwavering. A straight line of recognition that carried with it the weight of everything unspoken. When he did open his mouth, the first words were quiet, almost too quiet for the back rows to hear. The softness made them lean in, straining for every syllable. His voice had lost none of its southern cadence. If anything, it was more pronounced now, as though he were emphasizing it deliberately. "I reckon you want an answer," he said slowly, not rushing, not yielding. The room stilled further. He let the unfinished sentence hang, heavy with promise. He paused again. The silence was no longer awkward. It was orchestral, like the moment before the first note of a song. Someone in the audience coughed nervously, the sound sharp in the hush. Then came another fragment, his voice low but steady. "I'll give you one." That was all. He did not elaborate. He did not release the weight yet. He leaned back in his chair, letting the words settle, unfinished but charged. The anticipation in the room was unbearable now. The journalists knew they were no longer watching a press conference. They were participants in a confrontation between one man's dignity and the cynicism of an entire industry. What he would say next could humiliate him or immortalize him. And the brilliance of it was that Presley himself seemed in no hurry to relieve them. He had taken back the stage, not with music, not with movement, but with silence and fragments of speech that carried more force than any rehearsed statement. Every person in that room, whether friend or skeptic, was held in his grip, waiting for the moment when the storm would finally break. The pause had stretched to its breaking point. The reporters leaned in, eyes sharp, ears strained. The mocking question still hung in the smoke-filled air, but now it had transformed. It was no longer a casual jab at a celebrity. It had become a challenge to his very existence, to his past, to his people. Elvis drew a steady breath and spoke. His voice was quiet, but the room's silence carried it to every corner. The accent, the very thing mocked, was rich, unsoftened, as if he had decided to highlight it rather than hide it. "I talk," he began slowly, "the way my mama and daddy taught me." The words fell with the weight of a stone dropped in still water. No one chuckled, no one scribbled. They simply listened. He continued, his gaze fixed directly on the young reporter. "If that sounds funny to you, then I guess you're laughing at them. And at a whole lot of folks who speak just the same. Folks who work in mills, who drive trucks, who raise families with less than they deserve, but more pride than you'll ever understand." The room seemed to shrink. The reporter's smirk flickered, then faded. Elvis's tone was not sharp, not angry. It was firm, deliberate, unflinching. Each word was a declaration, not an outburst. He let the silence breathe again, then leaned a little closer to the microphone. "My accent isn't a trick. It isn't something I put on or take off. It's where I'm from. It's who I am. It's every Sunday morning singing hymns, every late night on Beale Street, every supper around a kitchen table in a house too small to hold more than hope." Somewhere in the middle rows, a pen stopped scratching. Another reporter lowered his notebook, realizing this was not material for mockery. It was testimony. Elvis did not stop there. His voice grew steadier, deeper, though never louder. "You ask if I should change it? Why would I? It's not a flaw. It's my roots. And those roots belong to millions of people in towns you never write about. People who keep this country running while you sit here asking if they ought to be ashamed of the way they sound." A murmur rippled in the back, not of laughter, but of awe. The press room, usually a place of interruptions and overlapping questions, had become a chapel. Each syllable landed as though carved into stone. Elvis let his eyes move from face to face, not rushing. He wasn't answering only the man who mocked him. He was addressing every person in that room, and beyond it, every person who would one day hear this story. "I'm proud of how I talk, because it means I haven't forgotten where I came from, and I don't plan to forget. Not for you, not for anybody." The silence that followed was deafening. A flashbulb popped, startling in the stillness. A few reporters shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, aware that the exchange had gone far beyond entertainment gossip. For a moment, Elvis seemed to soften. He let the intensity drain from his eyes and added almost gently, You see, I'm not trying to be somebody else. I'm just trying to be the same boy my mama raised. If that's not enough for you, that's all right. But it's enough for me." Those last words hung in the air like the final note of a hymn. They were not defensive. They were not bitter. They were resolute, simple, and undeniable. And then the silence broke. Not with questions, but with the faint, unexpected sound of applause. It began with a single pair of hands, then another, then spread like a wave. Within seconds, half the room was clapping. Not polite taps, but sharp, deliberate strikes that filled the space. The young reporter who had mocked him sat frozen, his notepad limp in his hands. The smirk was gone, replaced with something closer to disbelief. Elvis sat back, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. It was not triumphant, not boastful. It was almost humble, as though he had not delivered a retort, but spoken a truth too long left unspoken. The cameras flashed again, recording not a scandal, but a moment of history. The king of rock and roll, refusing to apologize for being the boy from Tupelo, refusing to separate himself from the people who had given him his voice. And though the conference was not over, the battle was. The room belonged to him. For several long seconds, the applause in the Hilton's press chamber seemed almost unreal. Press conferences did not end in clapping. They ended in hurried questions, scattered laughter, or the scraping of chairs as deadlines pulled reporters back to their typewriters. But this was different. The sound rolled through the room unevenly at first, hesitant, as if the journalists themselves could not quite believe they were doing it. Then it grew, spreading across rows until the rhythm of hands striking hands filled the air, where silence had reigned only moments before. Elvis did not stand, did not bow. He merely sat with that faint, modest smile, his hands resting quietly on the table. It was the reaction of a man who had not sought victory, but truth. And somehow, that made the scene even more powerful. The young reporter who had provoked him looked suddenly smaller in his chair. His pen no longer moved, his notepad drooping like a useless prop. The grin that had seemed so confident earlier was gone, replaced by a fixed expression somewhere between discomfort and humiliation. He glanced sideways, perhaps hoping for support from colleagues, but found only averted eyes. The laughter that had once echoed with his question had turned against him, leaving him exposed. Across the room, the older journalists understood what they had witnessed. One man from a New York daily leaned toward his companion and whispered, "That's the strongest answer I've heard in 20 years of doing this." Another, a columnist who had once been skeptical of Presley's cultural staying power, closed his notebook slowly, as if acknowledging that no clever turn of phrase he could write later would match the gravity of what had just been spoken. A photographer, camera raised, froze for a second too long. He realized he was no longer documenting an entertainer. He was preserving a moment of defiance, the transformation of ridicule into dignity. His shutter finally clicked, and the image captured Presley seated with quiet strength would circulate far beyond Las Vegas. The applause tapered off, but the atmosphere did not return to normal. Questions were asked again, but now they were gentler, even reverent. Gone were the smirks. Gone were the sharpened barbs. The tone had shifted entirely. Some journalists asked about his music, about his shows, about his family. None dared to circle back to his accent. The very air of the room told them that subject had been settled. What was more striking was the posture of the people themselves. A few lowered their pens altogether, as if realizing that to take notes at that moment would cheapen it. Others simply watched him, not as critics dissecting a subject, but as witnesses aware they had been part of something larger than themselves. Elvis responded with the same quiet courtesy as before. He did not gloat. He did not press the advantage. He answered questions about set lists, about new songs, about how he stayed healthy during the grueling performance schedule. His tone was measured, calm, almost gentle, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the room knew otherwise. Even in that moment, ripples had already begun to spread. A journalist from Chicago leaned back in his chair and muttered to no one in particular, "This one will stick. People will talk about this." He was right. The story would move beyond the walls of the Hilton, passed from one newsroom to another, retold in articles not about scandal, but about conviction. For the fans who would later hear the story, the meaning would be clear. Elvis Presley had not defended only himself. He had defended them, the millions who spoke with drawls, with twangs, with accents the polished elite dismissed as inferior. In the space of a few sentences, he had transformed the ridicule into pride. Inside the room, the shift was undeniable. Where there had been smirks, there was now respect. Where there had been a desire to expose weakness, there was now acknowledgement of strength. Some would later admit, privately, that they had come expecting an easy story. Elvis Presley once again mocked for being unsophisticated. Instead, they left with something entirely different. Elvis Presley, reminding them what America truly sounded like. And as he rose at the end of the conference, adjusting his jacket before walking toward the exit, something happened that had never happened before at one of these sessions. The majority of the journalists stood with him, not as fans, not as critics, but as people giving a man his due. It was not thunderous, not staged, but the sight of them rising as he walked out was as memorable as any roar of a Vegas crowd. It was, in its own way, a standing ovation. When Elvis stepped out of the Hilton's press chamber that day, the corridors outside buzzed with the ordinary chaos of Vegas. Hotel guests checking in, slot machines chiming endlessly, waitresses balancing trays of cocktails. Yet those who had been inside knew they were carrying something rare. They had not just witnessed another media event, they had witnessed a reckoning. As the door shut behind him, many journalists remained seated, almost reluctant to move. A few shuffled their notes, embarrassed by how trivial their scribbles looked compared to what had just been spoken. The young reporter who had provoked the exchange sat stiff in his chair, staring down at his notepad as though the words on it had betrayed him. He had come looking for spectacle, for a quote to turn into a cutting headline. Instead, he had become part of a story he could not control. A story in which he was not the victor. Within hours, wires hummed. Articles were drafted in smoky newsrooms from coast to coast. The expected scandal never came. Instead of mocking headlines, the papers carried words like, "Elvis stands his ground," or "A voice for the people who raised him." One columnist in New York wrote, almost grudgingly, "In a single answer, Presley reminded us that America speaks with many tongues, and none are lesser than another." For fans, the story spread like wildfire, retold with awe. It was not about his music this time, nor his stage clothes, nor his movie roles. It was about dignity. For people in small towns, for families who had long felt looked down upon for their accents or backgrounds, the moment became a kind of vindication. Elvis had spoken not only for himself, but for them, and he had done it in a room filled with people who had once dismissed him. Those who had been in that press chamber never forgot the silence that followed his words. It was not the silence of shock or of embarrassment. It was the silence of recognition. The moment when mockery collapsed under the weight of truth. That silence lingered far longer than the applause that eventually followed. Years later, some who were present would still recall it as vividly as the sound of his music. The young reporter who had mocked him never regained his footing. Though his article appeared in print, it was overshadowed by others who described the event with admiration. His smirk, frozen in photographs beside Elvis's steady gaze, became a symbol of arrogance undone. For him, it was a career misstep. For Presley, it was a defining moment. Elvis himself never boasted about it. He did not retell the story to his entourage, nor did he build it into his public persona. For him, it was not a victory to be milked. It was simply truth spoken at the right time. That humility only deepened the respect of those who heard about it afterward. In the months that followed, reporters still asked him difficult questions, but none dared again to ridicule the way he spoke. The line had been drawn. His accent, once treated as a flaw to exploit, became untouchable. He had reclaimed it, not just for himself, but for everyone who shared it. And so, the legend of that afternoon in 1972 grew. Among fans, it was passed down as one of those stories that revealed the man beneath the myth. Elvis not as a dazzling figure on stage, but as someone who carried the voices of his people with pride. Among journalists, it became an unspoken lesson. Sometimes the subject of your questions will answer with more truth than you are prepared to handle. The image that remained in memory was not of applause or ovation, but of the moment before he spoke, when the room froze under his silence. That hush, so heavy, so absolute, became part of the story itself, remembered as vividly as his words. For those who loved him, that was the real triumph. Not the rhinestones or the sold-out shows, but the reminder that greatness can sound like home, can carry the cadence of a kitchen table in Tupelo, and can silence a room full of skeptics without raising its volume. Long after the headlines faded, after the stage lights dimmed and the hotels filled with new acts, people still spoke of it. The man mocked for his voice had left the room in silence, and in that silence he had carved his legacy deeper than any hit single. It was the silence, more than the applause, that endured.